Oh, no.
Just run it by.
All right, good evening, both of you.
You better. Yeah, I'll take it. I'll take it.
Hey, Carly, could you open, close the door, please? All right, I'm gonna guess that everybody already knows this, but the funeral for Paul Conley is on Saturday at 11 o'clock. Saturday at 11 o'clock for the funeral for Paul Conley, just to make sure everybody knows that, that's this Saturday. Um, and also to let you know that, Sue Ernst needs lots of food to help. It's a big, big family. And so, please talk to Sue Ernst tonight before you leave, if you can help provide food for that funeral, for the family after the funeral on Saturday. Um, how big does the thing of cucumber salad need to be?
I don't know, but she told me like they're expecting over 75 people.
Yeah, it's a big group, because they are a big family, and, so, so if you need baked beans, we want them in bowls like this big, or whatever you bring. So, but please talk to, Sue Ernst before you leave. She said if she doesn't get the food, that, Susan Norton has to do all the cooking, so, that might be fun to see that challenge, I'm just saying, but, okay, let's, get started tonight, and we're gonna be in the book of Job and talk about that. Alan, would you lead us in a opening prayer, please?
Sure. Father in heaven, we thank you for the wonderful day you provided for us. Thank you for providing safe trips to a lot of us who went to Vicki West's funeral today. Thank you for letting us go and come in safely. And we ask your blessing to your comfort on that family as they grieve the loss of the daughter. We also ask tonight, Father, that you be with Jody as he presents to us the book of Job. May we glean those truths from it that will be applicable to our lives, and may we learn many good things from that particular book. Watch over and guide us and correct us. Please forgive us for the things that are wrong in our lives. Help us to overcome the things that displease you, and help us to magnify Jesus. And for it's truly in his precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so, I'm gonna try to do this a little bit different. So if you've sat in this study on the book of Job before, it's gonna be different. I don't know how many of you have, but not many, because there's not many here tonight anyway. I've always tried to go, and I think, deeper into the book itself, and maybe gotten a little more into the weeds of some of it. And I realized that God left this book for us, not just as a study tool, which it can be tremendously interesting, to look at it that way, but so that we can gain application from it. So we can learn, what are we supposed to, why do we have this book, and how's it going to help me, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're going to do to look at this quarter. We'll try to look at it a little differently by, doing some teaching part of what, some of the things that we need to know, I think are important to learn. And then we'll spend some time to talk about some principles that we can get from it. So the book of Job is a fascinating book, and it is, not only because it's part of God's canon or biblical scripture, but it's really a fascinating book, considered a classic among, literary works that have been written, through the years. It's recognized as a classic, in non-biblical circles because, number one, it's so well written. Secondly, because it's uniquely put together. If you've got your Bible open, I want you to look at the book of Job. Look at the first, look at the transition between chapter 2 and chapter 3, especially at verse 3. What do you see? Just to look at it. Now that's going to read it. Just what do you see when you look at it?
Gloom,
What?
gloom, despair.
Okay, now, but that's because you're reading it. What do you see just by looking at it? Don't read the words, just look at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. Nobody sees anything any different between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3.
The way it's broken down.
There you go. All right, you're right on it. Okay. So in chapter 3, you begin with broken lines or poetry. Okay. The first 2 chapters are prose. It's just written in paragraph form as we would think of it today, with some exception. You can see at verse 21 of chapter 1, that's poetic. Okay, now turn to the back of the book. This question is going to be a little bit easier for you. What do you see the difference between chapter 42, verse 6 and verse 7?
Goes back the way it was.
Hey, there we go. All right, you'll really catch it on now. Okay. So it goes back to prose, okay, for the end of chapter 42. So that's one of the unique features of the book of Job, and that's why part of the reason it's recognized as a classic is just how it's put together. You've got about 2 chapters worth of prose, followed by all these chapters of poetry, and it closes with a half a chapter of prose. So that begs the question, what? Why? Why is it put together that way? Okay. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. So it's uniquely put together. It also, the reason, one of the biggest reasons it's considered a classic in even non-biblical circles is because we consider some of the greatest subjects that men have ever tried to probe: the nature of God, the nature of suffering, the nature of evil, and that's going to be talked about in the book itself. So the material, the depth of the material was very challenging. The arrangement of it is very challenging in the sense of why is it done this way, and just that it's so well written from the Hebrew standpoint of and I'm not a Hebrew linguist in any shape or fashion, but the beauty of that in and of itself is unique. It makes it kind of stand out in that way. So I want to look at a couple of things. Since I've mentioned that, let's talk about this form. The majority of the book of Job is conversation. It's speeches, really. It's speeches would be a better word, because Job is going to talk about in chapter 3 his horrible condition of life. In fact, chapter 3 basically says, I wish I was never born. And I wish the day on which I was born was stricken off of the calendar. And if I was going to be born, I wish I had died as a young child, because all this pain, all this grief, all this hurt that he's feeling, he's just overwhelmed by all of that. And his friends come, at least 4. These friends come and sit with Job, and it says they sit with him for 7 days and they don't say a word. And Job, do you know, where is Job? Do you know? During that time? He's sitting out on an ash heap and just in miserable condition. I mean, he's just so terribly devastated, which we'll get into, obviously, in the text. But then, so look at chapter 3. That's Job's lament. And then in chapter 4, verse 1, then Eliphaz, the Temanite, responded and begins to say this: if one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? So on and so forth. And how are they speaking? Well, they're speaking in poetry, because it's broken lines against, not prose. Then look at chapter 6 and verse 1. Then Job responded, oh, that my grief were actually weighed and laid in the balances, and so on. Job goes on in chapter 7. Then look at chapter 8 and verse 1. Then Bildad, the Shuhite, he was a very short man. He was only a Shuhite. Okay. I do that.
Writers.
Huh?
New writers.
New right, yes, sir. And so I'm just, I throw these in for free. Okay? I'll be here all week. So Bildad the Shuhite, he responds, okay, and he's going to talk. Then chapter 9 and verse 1, Job talks again. So it's an exchange of speeches is what I'm just trying to point out for you. Job will say one thing, Eliphaz responds. Then Job says something else, then Bildad responds. Then Zophar speaks, And Job would respond. And now we're back to Eliphaz again. Eliphaz talks and Job responds. And they go through this cycle again. And then finally, this guy named Elihu comes up and he gives this long pontification and talks for a while. And Job's just kind of like, I don't know what's going on in my life. And he really honestly doesn't know what's happening. And he's facing all of this. But here's our question. And the reason I asked you about this prose and poetry is that we have to look at the book of Job and say, okay, so number one, is this a true historical account of something that happened? Is Job a real man? Are these four friends that come and talk, are they real people? Or is this just a literary work, a fiction that God's put in the Bible for us to learn something from? So it's either totally historical, some suggest, actual people and actual dialogue, which would mean they're speaking poetically every time they speak, or it's totally a literary work of fiction, and that this is just all made up to make a point. Or what I think it actually is a literary adaptation of a historical event. I think Job is a real man. I think Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and Elihu, I think they were real people. I think Job really did have 10 children. Job really did lose everything that he had and then lost his health. And he's just, woe is me. And he's a real man. But then when God put it for us, he did it in a way that was, in my judgment, that's a literary form using poetic language. Now, why would you do that? Why would God do that? If I'm right on that, why would he do it that way?
Make it easy to read.
Easier to read and easier to remember. Yeah, to understand it well, that can be, poetry sometimes can be confusing, but to remember this, because they didn't walk around with Bibles like we had. I mean, very, 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 very few scrolls were written in this time. So I think it's a literary adaptation of a historical event. I think these are real people, and now God's going to tell the story and it be in this written form so I can look at it, read it, and appreciate not just dialogue, but the message in more of a poetic way. And sometimes poetry is easier to remember. Poetry, Hebrew poetry was not written like we tend to think of. First of all, it wasn't rhyming. And secondly, it wasn't even necessarily done in such a way that you had this phrase and meter and timing and so on and so forth. It was more of a dualism. This stated and then it's stated again. And then it's stated again and that's how poetry would be most often written. But anyway, I don't want to get too far into that. I just want to suggest that to you. So a couple other questions just to get into the book itself is the date of when did these events happen? So I'm going to suggest to you that the events of the book of Job probably go all the way back to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, around that time period. And here's the reason why. Several reasons why. Wealth is measured in cattle and slaves, not in lands. There is no mention of the Mosaic structure or institution at all. The law is never mentioned. The Sabbath is never mentioned. The temple is never mentioned in the book of Job. So it probably predates all of that. Also, there is the longevity of life that seems to go more with the older age of it. And then I would suggest to you also, because Job is going to function as a priest for his own family. And that predates the Mosaic structure. So I think it's before Moses, early takes place. I don't know when it was written. And it all takes place in a place called Uz, U-Z, Uz, which sounds kind of like sounds kind of like a mythical place that we know of as Oz, okay? It kind of sounds like Oz. So we have two choices. This place, Uz, if this is real, which I think it is, it's northeast of Canaan near Damascus. Thus, Job and his friends were Canaanites. You could I'm not gonna look at all these verses, but you could go to Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 22, that there were people known as Uz, or it could be southeast of Canaan, which means near Edom. That would mean they would be Arabians. Genesis chapter 36, there's a person by the name of Uz mentioned there. Lamentations 4, there's a geographical location named Uz in Genesis 36. So that could be the place of where it is. But again, I don't think, I'll just put it this way, I don't think either one of those things really make a big difference on what the message of the book is. But I just throw that out there for you to think about. So, or to make you look at me like, what is he talking about? That's the other reason I did that. So, okay. So let me see if you have a question or anything on that. That is as possibly in the briefest introduction to the book of Job ever done. So, any question or thought that you have? Yes, Dan.
I've heard that even if preachers say that it doesn't even belong in scripture.
Mhm.
And what's the typical argument for that? I mean, I think the argument that was presented to me was, this doesn't sound like God.
Right.
And so, and my view of it is, it actually reveals God. So
Right.
I'm not sure what the argument was. Maybe you have more information.
Well, there's some things that come off sounding mythological in the book, and so some would say that God's not going to be dealing with myth or mythological creatures. There's creatures that sound like a dragon almost, that fire breathing. Some of them take that, as well as, like you said, the position. This just doesn't sound like God striking a bargain with the Satan. And that's where we start out. That's probably the biggest reason that I would say. And it does beg some questions that we will talk about, Joe.
If, I don't know, I had this conversation one time with somebody about Book of Jonah. And it being just, it was just put there out of the story. But yet Jesus used it as if it was a real thing.
Right.
And I think the only place in the New Testament I think that Job's mentioned that I could ever find is in James.
Mm-hmm.
And James mentions about, you've heard about the endurance of Job.
Right.
As if it was a real thing.
Right.
Yeah. Granted, it could have been just, but.
Well, one of the other prophets, and I have the reference in front of me right now, I can't remember, but one of the other prophets mentions Job as one of the three great heroes of the Old Testament, as well. So, yeah, I think it's real. I think Job is a real person. These people are real. This is a real historical event. But see, if I'm going to be somebody who doubts this or doesn't accept that God is real, first of all, and that God would reveal himself to us, then I can see where people would say, look, people don't talk in poetic fashion, unless you're watching Seven Brides for Seven Brothers or Fiddler on the Roof, where we break into song now, in the midst of something, and that's poetic. No, I think it's an adaptation for us to have, but I think they're real people, and I think it's a real event, and Job really did experience this horrible suffering in this way. Anything else? Go ahead, Nick.
And just to comment on the mythical creatures, extinction of species is not a modern invention.
Right.
In fact, I think we have no idea, types and numbers of creatures that have, been left to histories, primarily because of man, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah. Were there dinosaurs or are they just all made up? And that's kind of how people look at it and see, or these kind of individual creatures that we might read about or think about, if that's the case. But absolutely. And it wouldn't disprove God in any way that you had extinction of thousands of different species or animals. It wouldn't validate anything that would try to disprove God. But okay, so let's open up the book. Let's do chapter 1. We'll start and talk about it a little bit tonight. So there was this man. See, and it even starts out, almost sounds like like you're reading a fairy tale. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. You can see how you might read that and think, wait a minute, that doesn't sound real. Okay. there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. Anybody have the old King James in here tonight? Okay, what's the old King James say about Job's description?
There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, one that feared God, eschewed evil.
Okay, so the impression is, if you're reading from the old King James Version, that Job was sinlessly perfect. Okay, I mean, he was perfect. That's really a kind of a misnomer. I mean, Bible students understand the word perfect a lot of times just means mature or full grown, can be blameless. This is how the New American Standard translates it, blameless. But he had 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Now, who in the world do you know who could have 10 children? Okay, so, yeah, that's right. So all we have to do is look at Wayne. Okay, so you see Wayne and Trudy have 10 kids. So it doesn't just tackle the mind that somebody actually had 10 children. But notice the imagery here. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. So what do you know about the number 7 in the Bible? Yes, references a perfect number. Now, here's the reason. Now, we don't know why, okay, how they come up with this, but here's what most people think, that 3 is the number of what? God, okay, or divinity, okay? That 3 is the number of divinity. And why, how in the world could you come up with that? 3 being the number of divinity. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Exactly. So 3 is a perfect number in the sense of representing divinity. Now, this is for people who study numerology, which I don't study, but I'm just telling you what I know about. So 4 is what? No, do you know anything about the number 4? Huh? Is it one more than 3? Okay. Thank you, John. Okay. All right. If anybody in here sat in Jody's Revelation class the last couple of weeks, anybody, let's see, Edwin's been in that class. What do you know about the number scale? Okay, okay. It's the number that is most often referred to for man, because you have the 4 corners of the earth. You have the north, south, east, and west. People talk about
It says every time.
Huh?
That's what you say.
I know, I tell you that every time. So if we add 3 plus 4, what do we get? Hey, look at that. So we got the number 7, which is everything divine and everything human or man. So you have the totality of the completeness of everything is how most people think this idea of this number 7 representing perfection. Okay, now let's look back at the text. He has 7 sons. So what does he have? He has the perfect number of sons. And he has 3 daughters, which obviously they're 3 divine angels, okay? He has 3 divine daughters is the number that some people think. So if you have 7 plus 3, what do you get? 10. And 10 is also represented as a perfect or complete or full number. So people will look at this and say, this is not real, see? I mean, it's just an imaginary man with an imaginary perfect family. He's perfect, and he has a perfect family. It's how they would discredit or try to discredit this. Now, look at what he says. His possessions were 7,000 sheep. So he has the perfect number of sheep times 1,000. Okay, is how many he has. And then he's got all of these other animals, all this, just complete names, all these things. And then drop down to verse, let me just keep on. So his sons, verse 4, his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house, and each one on his day, and they would send word and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of feasting were completed, their cycle, Job would then send word to them to consecrate them, getting up early in the morning and offering a burnt offering according to the number of all of them. For Job said, perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts, and Job did this completely. They're continuing. So you have these 10 children. They get along perfectly. It's a perfect man with a perfect number of children, whose children get along perfectly. They party together, they enjoy each other. And Job is so perfect that what does he do? He goes and makes an offering for them every time they have a party the next day and says, maybe one of my sons, maybe he was drunk and he cursed God. And I want to make sure that I atone for that. Okay. So, I mean, it just sounds like perfection, 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 perfection. But the picture is of Job and this good man. I can look at it in that way as well. There was a day now, at verse 6, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan, by the way, there's only one time in the Bible, only one time in the Old Testament where if you read the word Satan, the word "the" is not in front of it. So it is, people have asked me, why do you say "the Satan"? Because that's what the text says. Um, Literally. So it says, and the Satan also came among them, and the Lord said to the Satan, where, where do you come from? And the Satan answered the Lord, and he said, from roaming on the earth and walking around on it. And the Lord said to the Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there's no one like him on all the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. So then the Satan answered the Lord and says, does Job fear God for nothing? You've planted a fence or a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side. You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But, here's the challenge, verse 11, but reach out with your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will certainly curse you to your face. And the Lord said to the Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not reach out and put your hand on him. So the Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. Okay, there's a couple challenging things in this. Okay, so where is God in this? Where is he? Where is he located? Doesn't say, but where would you figure he is? What?
Someplace having a meeting,
Okay.
thank heaven.
Okay, I'm presuming that he is in heaven when he does this. There's a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. So he is the one who's there. They're coming to him. And the Satan comes and also says unto him, that God said to him, where have you come from? Where have you been? The Satan says, oh, I've been walking all over the earth, been going to and fro, looking for someone. He doesn't tell us what for, but we get the impression from the answer of God. But he said, I've been going to and fro on the earth and looking, walking around, roaming. The Lord said, well, have you considered my servant Job? So what is the Satan looking for? So that's right, someone or a person, whoever it is, he's looking for someone that the Satan wants to put to the test. And the test is, I want to see if I touch him, if he's afflicted in any way, if he won't curse God. Because I don't think man really wants to serve God. That's really what Satan's saying. I don't think man wants to serve God. And so God says, you consider my servant Job? I tell you, to me, that's one of the scariest verses in all the Bible. Okay, because who brings up the name of Job? God does. And it almost comes off to me like fatherly pride and says, what about Job? Have you thought about Job? If that's the case, I don't ever want to be so good that God says, hey, you thought about Job? No, I mean, I would like to be, truthfully, but I don't want to face what Job faced. But here is God says, have you thought about Job? And the Satan says, well, you planted a fence around. You've got your protection. You take that fence down. You touch him and you afflict him in any way, and he will curse you to your face. And God says, go ahead and try. You can't touch him, but go ahead and try. That's terribly frightening to me. And that brings up the question that Dane brought up earlier. That doesn't seem like God. Does that seem like God striking a bargain with the Satan? Or making some kind of, the other question is, what is the Satan doing in heaven anyway? Hasn't he been kicked out of heaven? And so what is he doing in heaven? Well, he's obviously coming to give a report, as it were, has to. Go ahead, Nick.
So, just to be blunt, I don't see this as God being in heaven. I see him being on the earth, kind of like the imagery we get in the Garden of Eden. You know, he's walking among men and saying that. That's kind of imagery I get from.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I could see that being the case. I guess I've always presumed since they're coming to him, they're coming to where God is, in the sense of being in him.
And the imagery we also consider here, it sounds very much like the souls that are crying out, you know, how long, you know?
Right.
And so it doesn't even seem very uncommon among God's people that they are challenged by Satan and the dark forces of the present age,
Right.
you know, to overcome. That's part of who God's people are. You know, they overcome in Christ.
Sure, and I mean, and that's, the Satan doesn't believe it. They won't stick with you. If they suffer in any way at all, they'll turn their back on you. They'll curse you to your face. And so God says, go ahead. You can't touch him, but go ahead and try. So on the day when the sons and the daughters were eating and drinking, verse 13, that is, they were having one of these get-togethers, these parties, eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the female donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabians came and attacked and took them. They also killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While while he was still speaking, verse 16, another one came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Verse 17. And while he was still speaking, another one came, and they said the Chaldeans formed 3 units and made a raid on the camels and took them and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was still speaking, another one came and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they all died, and I alone have come to tell you. So what happened? Everything that could go wrong went wrong. Okay, lost his servants, lost his cattle, lost all 10 of his children. But you see the poetic form, even though this is prose, this poetic literary form, and I alone have escaped to tell you. As soon as that one finished, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And there is a literary form that's being used here to tell this story. Then Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell down on the ground, and he cursed God. No, it doesn't say that, okay? It doesn't. That's what we might think it would say. Why me? Why the Lord? Why did you? No, look what it said. He fell down on the ground and he worshiped God. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And despite all of this, I mean, despite all these horrible things that happened to him, he did not sin, nor did he blame God. Doesn't mean he sinned less. It means he didn't sin regarding the situation, and he didn't blame God for the situation. So, round 1, who wins? God wins, right? Job wins. I mean, because Satan did everything he could. And Job doesn't blame God, doesn't curse God. So, what can we learn from that? What can we take away from that for ourselves today, maybe to help us out, or to think about in our own life? Can you think of anything?
Bad things happen to good people.
Okay, bad things happen to good people. Okay, and that actually we can see that in this book over and over again. And Job continues to scratch his head, continues to ask God, continues to look for an answer. And as far as we know, Job never gets an answer. See, we're privy to what's going on in Satan's bargain, as it were, with God. We're privy to that. Job didn't know this has happened. Job's a good man, living a good life, has a perfect family, and it looks like everything in the world that could go wrong just went wrong in my life. And it all happened in one day. As soon as this report, then the next report, then the next report, everything that could, and God, he doesn't blame God, he falls down, he worships. So again, verse 1 of chapter 2, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. It definitely proves or suggests the idea that they're having to give an answer to God and present themselves before him. And the Satan also came to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said unto the Satan, where have you been? Where have you come from? And Satan answered and said, from roaming about on the earth and walking around on. Anything different than before? No, same thing. I've been out looking for somebody. Okay. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Oh, no, not again. Yes, again. Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And then look at this. And he still holds firm to his integrity, although you incited him against me to ruin him without cause. So did God afflict afflict Job? No, God didn't afflict Job. The Satan afflicted him, and God allowed it. He tolerated it. But now God says, you did all of that, and he still remains faithful to me. And you try to ruin him. You try to overturn him. The Satan answered and said, yes, skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he'll give for his life. However, if you reach out with your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, he will curse you to your face. So the Lord said to the Satan, no, you can't have him this time. No, he didn't say it. He said, behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. You cannot kill him, but what? What can you do this time? You can touch him personally, his physical body, flesh and bone. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he struck Job with severe boils from the sole of his foot to the top of his head. And Job took a piece of pottery and scraped himself with it while he was sitting in the ashes. So the boils, we'll talk a little bit more about it later as you get in, because it's more than just what you think of, what we tend to think of as a boil. I get burned, we got a little blister, I pop the blister, everything's fine. I mean, it maybe looks nasty for a week or two, but everything's okay. A lot of us have had a boil before. But this has actually been considered as it's some horrible kind of skin affliction. As we read later, it talks about some of the characteristics of what Job's body was feeling at this time. So he's sitting out on an ash heap with a piece of broken pottery, scraping himself, trying to get some relief. And his wife says to him, do you still hold firm to your integrity? Curse God and die. Now, we can look at this two ways, and either one fits. She looks at her husband, and he is in such grief and such pain and such misery. They've already lost all their children. They lost all their wealth. They lost everything. Now he's afflicted physically, just in torment. That she is so loving and so caring and just can't seem to bear that he's feeling so bad. She says, why don't you just curse God? Because if you curse God, he would kill you and it'll all be over with. That could be the case. The other case could be, you ought to just curse God who's done all of this to you. Curse God and get it over with, and he'll kill you. He'll take you out. But she doesn't seem, I don't see her as being the loving, caring wife, but she could be. I mean, that is actually a possible way she could feel about her husband. But remember, she lost a lot of all these. I don't know if all these children were hers, but she lost all of this as well. But he said to her, and this is why it seems to me that it's more than negative, you're speaking like one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we accept good from God, but not accept adversity? Despite all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. So even with all this physical, horrible affliction that's fallen on him, Job doesn't curse God. He doesn't blame God. He doesn't sin against God. He even rebukes his wife. We had good things coming, and we thank God. When bad things happen, shouldn't we still hold on to God? And now, when Job's three friends heard about his adversity that had come upon him, they came, each one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamite. And they made an appointment together to come and sympathize with him and to comfort him. And when they looked from a distance and did not recognize him, they raised their voices and they wept. And each one of them tore his robe and threw dust on their heads toward the sky. And then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw that his pain was very great. So Job is a good man, an upright man, a blameless man. And everything in the world that could go wrong has gone wrong in his life, it looks like. He's lost all of his wealth. He's lost all of his children. One sense, he's lost his wife in the way she responds. We find out later in the book, he lost his reputation. Just everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong. And Job still holds on to his integrity with God. So it begs the question, maybe that we ought to ask, and that is, would you worship God if he didn't offer you anything? If he didn't give you anything, would you worship God just because he's God? Well, we should. I mean, the answer is we should. And that's kind of what Job says. Should we receive the good but not the bad? I mean, if he's really God, whether he ever offers me heaven, ever answers a prayer, ever does one thing for me, I still should worship God because he's God. And that's kind of what's going on in this situation, because remember, we're privy to the agreement that's been struck between God and Satan. Job doesn't know what that is. Job just knows, I've been trying to live a good life, and my life has just fallen completely in the toilet. I have lost every single thing. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it kind of shows me too, to be aware that Satan uses in our lives, because he takes away the things that he loves most when you're grieving, when you're sick, when you're suddenly in financial distress. Those are things Satan obviously will use if he can. And so it's good for us to know that we're vulnerable then.
That's right. And I mean, to go back to what Edwin's point was before when he said about bad things happen to good people. I mean, here is Job. And again, he doesn't know any of this. We're privy to it because it's recorded for us. All he knows is, I've been trying to live a good life, and everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. Okay?
When Job says, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? There's a level of wisdom there that's extremely rare, spiritual wisdom. We don't get that in a lot of scripture. Maybe we get a fair amount of that from David, man, it's on the heart, and such. But these are the kind of words that come from Jesus, and education, a spiritual understanding of who God is. And this is a remarkable moment,
It is, and that he's able to say what he's able to say. I mean, no, we hold on to God no matter what. And I'm not going to turn my back on God. In fact, I think really one of the great messages we ought to take away from this is that we need to cling to God no matter what. Adversity or times of great abundance and blessing. And then the other thing that I wanted to leave with you, and that is that God is worthy of our worship, whether he offers us anything or not. And the third thing I think we've got to walk away with from this is the Satan is out to destroy you. Amen. He wants to bring you down no matter what, any way that he can, any possible avenue that he opens up or that you open up for him. He's there to try to jump in and to bring you down. I mean, we can joke and tease, and here's the pitchfork and and whatever, and horns on the, no, this is real demonic forces that are out to destroy your soul and my soul. Satan wants nothing more than for me to spit in the face of God or just become indifferent toward God. and just say, well, you know, hey, you want to have God in your life, that's fine, but he's not for me. You know, Satan wins in that scenario just as much as if I curse God. So we all face problems. We all face challenges. Thank God none of us have ever faced all that Job has faced in these two chapters that we've just read. If Job can hold on facing all of that, then surely I can hold on when somebody slights me, when I get cut off in traffic, when somebody does something to me that I lose my job, when my family suffers struggles or trials. Surely without griping and complaining to realize heaven is worth it all and to hold on regardless of what. So, all right, so next week, just to tell you, and our time is up, if you will just, all you need to do is read chapter 3. That's all we're going to talk about next week. And then the next week after that, if you want to get into the first cycle, I think it's chapters 4 through 8. The first cycle of speeches will be the following lesson. But next week is just chapter 3. And let me tell you ahead of time, it's gloomy and dark. So don't be driving over a bridge right before you, right after you read it or anything like that. Okay, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your interest.
There was 3 more perfect numbers. 4 servants we had. And you've got 3 friends that stayed 7 days.
Okay, there you go. All right.
I think it's just a sense.
It's a test.
All right, thank you much. And if you were in my class before, Joe, I'm not giving quizzes next time, okay? Because my wife didn't like me doing that. And I live.
Yes.
Oh, they give him his wisdom. He created them.
Oh, I agree. But I'm just saying we should.
He should.
Because it's, you know,
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, this has been before God bring it over to out of heaven. Wow.
Yeah, there's usually, I need to bring this, I'll make a copy of it, I have a worksheet on the state. Is that there's a progressive. So I think it may be and they still have to come back and report it to God. That's what I think.
Because I was going to, okay, God let him come. I mean, he could easily.
Exactly.
And the fact that he kept saying he was watching, but he didn't say what he was watching for. Something, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to be correct.
Yeah, the sons of God.
Just like, yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I didn't want to tell Dan he was on that. Yeah.
But also the fact that when he said he shouldn't worship God just because he's God, that's almost an impossible scenario to think she is herself, because he's blessed all of us.
Oh, right.
In many ways, you know, you have problems, but he started out blessed. It was hard to imagine.
She's number 1.
He did.
Well, if you have this, my thinking is, should we respect the police officer?
Radiation.
So, yes, you should. I may not know anything about it. He might be his superior in any number of ways. I mean, I'm sure you all spiritually and everything.
I'm
But
not
he's
gonna,
wearing a badge,
she
and
explained,
he pulls me over, and I say, yes,
that
yes.
I can do that, but she would
So should I
advise
serve God?
do it
Well,
there.
never-
Because everyone is right there, you don't have the communication there. And that's all he does is gastrointestinal. That's it. And doing the other kind of chemo for gastrointestinal.
To replace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That does give us reward in
Likewise,
whatever.
radiation,
In our
all
fun.
it does is going.
Good luck.
When it comes to what I understand about the radiation treatments, it's like 5 days a week for like an extended period of time. So I'll come in with it. They have a place for that. Yeah. I'll just turn it on.
So the chemo doctor is gonna,
Up to a spray.
and,
And they'll
and
do
the
a
trial
blood draw.
today was not bad. I could even do it.
Yeah.
So I could.
Oh.
Oh, somebody's little chocolate. I like you very much.